For a long time, it was considered absolutely impossible to stop a massive attack that swept away any obstacles in its path. The Carthaginian commander deployed 80 giant combat units against the legions, counting on the rapid destruction of the enemy formation. The Roman infantry responded with a completely unexpected maneuver that thwarted all of the enemy's plans. The Carthaginian leader is generally considered an unbeatable master of tactics, unmatched in the ancient world. However, on the plains of North Africa, he encountered a commander who had spent many years carefully studying his every trick. The Roman commander did not come to this continent just to conduct another routine military campaign. He intended to use the Carthaginians' own art of maneuvering in open spaces against them. The two armies met on a wide, flat plain near the ancient city of Zama. The terrain was flat, with no significant hills, deep ravines, or dense forests. Such flat terrain was ideal for deploying large infantry formations in precise geometric lines. Both commanders understood perfectly well the importance of correctly positioning their enormous forces before the decisive clash. The fate of the entire Mediterranean region for many decades to come depended on this. The Carthaginian army was a complex mechanism assembled from completely different and dissimilar parts. The first line consisted of mercenary troops recruited from among experienced warriors of various tribes. Behind them were units of the civil militia, defending the approaches to their native capital. Each soldier knew exactly his place in the ranks and the algorithm of actions for any enemy movements. On the flanks were units of allied cavalry, ready at any moment to support the advance of the main body of infantry. This army was a single monolithic block, capable of synchronized reorganization right during the march. The most important advantage for the Romans was the defection of experienced Numidian horsemen to their side. These cavalrymen were renowned for their incredible mobility and ability to maneuver quickly over rough terrain. Previously, they had formed the basis of Carthage's striking power, ensuring its superiority on the flanks. Now, hundreds of light cavalrymen were preparing to unleash their wrath on their former allies. Their presence radically changed the usual tactical balance of forces before the start of the battle. Tension in both camps grew as the sun rose above the horizon. Soldiers checked the strength of the straps on their shields and the reliability of the fastenings on their heavy spears. Commanders rode around the formations, giving final, clear instructions to the commanders of small tactical units. Thick dust rose from thousands of feet, forming a dense veil over the entire wide plain. The silence was broken only by the measured clang of metal and the dull thuds of wooden shafts against the dry ground. The weather on the day of the decisive battle was hot and dry, which was typical for this region. The scorching sun heated the bronze helmets and metal plates on the legionnaires' armor. The absence of strong winds meant that the dust raised by the troops would hang in the still air for a long time. This thick veil severely limited visibility, preventing commanders from quickly assessing the situation in distant areas. Commanders had to rely solely on pre-agreed plans and the discipline of their subordinates. His scouts gathered the smallest details about how to control them in dense formations. The entire tactics of the legions were completely redesigned specifically to neutralize this particular strike factor. The soldiers underwent grueling training, learning to act unconventionally when faced with a gigantic danger. These creatures were not just an exotic addition to the infantry, but real mobile siege towers. They were trained for years, accustomed to the loud sounds of trumpets, the glare of armor, and the gathering of huge crowds. Controlling such a unit required incredible skill from the driver sitting on its massive neck. In the heat of battle, they had to act as a single, coordinated, destructive mechanism. The visual impact of 80 such giants lined up in a long line was colossal. Their massive silhouettes towered over the ranks of infantry, casting long shadows on the parched African soil. The skins were often covered with special protective elements to minimize damage from flying shells. The ground itself began to shake noticeably when this massive formation took even a single synchronized step forward. Even the most disciplined warriors felt an instinctive sense of unease at the sight of the approaching living wall. Historically, Roman soldiers had already encountered similar combat units in previous conflicts. Previous attempts to stop them using traditional methods often led to the destruction of dense infantry formations. The standard tactic was to try to bombard the advancing line with a hail of heavy spears and javelins. However, thick skin and enormous mass allowed the giants to ignore most of these hits. They simply crushed into the front ranks of the legionaries, scattering men and breaking sturdy wooden shields. The traditional chess-like formation of the legions proved extremely vulnerable to such a battering ram attack. Small tactical units could not hold their position when a multi-ton moving mass crashed into them. The broken formation quickly lost its combat effectiveness, as the legionnaires were deprived of the support of their neighbors. The enemy's light infantry immediately rushed into the gaps that had formed, developing a tactical breakthrough. It was on this scenario that the experienced Carthaginian commander-in-chief made his main bet. The main task of the first wave was to create an initial shock and mass confusion in the enemy's ranks. The dense formation of attacking giants was supposed to crush the advanced units of Roman javelin throwers. However, this tactic had one significant and extremely dangerous vulnerability, which both commanders were aware of. When severely frightened, the animals could completely stop obeying their driver's commands. Under heavy fire, they would begin to rush from side to side, looking for a way out of the trap. At such moments, they posed the same threat to both the enemy and their own troops. The drivers carried special tools to neutralize their charges if they lost control. By placing all this power in the front line, the commander was taking a great risk with his own advance units. He hoped that a swift attack would not give the Romans time to organize strong resistance. The momentum of the battle was supposed to shift to Carthage from the very first minutes of the large-scale clash. The Roman soldiers standing in the front lines could see the threat looming over them in every detail. They gripped the handles of their spears tightly, trying not to give in to the growing internal tension. Their commanders constantly walked along the even rows, giving orders to remain absolutely calm. The discipline of the legions was put to the most severe test during these tense moments of anticipation. Such a massive threat required completely new, unconventional tactical solutions. The Roman commander understood perfectly well that a head-on collision would lead to irreparable losses among the veterans. He devised a cunning plan that would turn the enemy's strength against itself. The maneuver required the absolute synchronization of thousands of soldiers across a vast, dusty expanse. You will find out exactly how the legions accomplished this seemingly impossible task in the next chapter of our story. The hidden code that changes everything we know about tactics lies in the unique structure of the Roman legions. Until then, the Roman army had always used a classic chessboard formation for its units. The second-line units covered the gaps left between the first-line units. The commander made an unprecedented decision to radically change the centuries-old traditions of Roman military art. He ordered the second and third-line manipuli to stand directly behind the first-line units. Thus, the chessboard order was replaced by parallel columns with wide passages between them. These passages stretched across the entire formation of the legions, from the front lines to the deepest rear of the army. The entire huge Roman formation turned into a complex network of wide and absolutely straight-through corridors. The implementation of such a maneuver required an incredible level of training and nerves of steel from each warrior. Lightly armed soldiers had to stand still until the threat was close at hand. The dispersal and retreat behind the lines of heavy infantry had to happen instantly and without the slightest panic. Any delay or disruption in formation would have led to mass stampedes and the failure of the entire tactical plan. Officers continuously practiced these coordinated maneuvers in training for several weeks. The heavily armed legionnaires forming the walls of the corridors also received strict instructions. They were not to attack the targets rushing past with a frontal assault or attempt to stop them. Their task was to attack the flanks of the units running through the formation with their heavy throwing spears. Trapped in the narrow space between the walls of shields, the attackers became excellent targets for the legionaries. This turned the corridors into an ideal trap where the Romans had complete tactical superiority. This tactical masterpiece clearly demonstrated the flexibility of Roman military thinking at the time. The ability to abandon proven patterns in order to adapt to a specific threat became a decisive factor. The legions were transformed from a rigid and unwieldy instrument into a flexible, adaptive defense system. It was a true triumph of intellect and discipline over raw, uncontrolled physical power. The geometry of the battlefield changed forever at the very moment the corridors were finally formed. Such an incredible approach to solving the most complex tactical problems deserves the closest attention. The ingenuity of the Roman officers saved the day and radically changed the course of the entire great campaign. The signal for the start of the massive attack sounded from the center of the Carthaginian positions with a loud roar of many trumpets. The drivers simultaneously directed their giant combat units forward, giving them a powerful starting impulse. A huge gray wave began its relentless movement toward the frozen Roman infantry ranks. The earth responded with a deep rumble that was instantly felt by every legionnaire on the battlefield. The line of attackers rapidly gained speed, accelerating across the flat space between the armies. The huge animals broke into a heavy trot, raising giant clouds of thick, acrid dust into the air. Their heavy footsteps merged into a single continuous rumble, reminiscent of a powerful earthquake approaching. The dust cloud grew with every second, gradually obscuring the Carthaginian infantry marching behind. The Roman soldiers could see only dark silhouettes looming out of the dust, inexorably closing the distance. The Roman light infantry at the front watched intently as this crushing force approached. Their task was to withstand maximum pressure and not retreat before a strictly defined time. They clutched their javelins in their hands, waiting for the officer's command to strike the first blow. The distance was rapidly closing, and soon the details of the Carthaginian charioteers' equipment became visible. The psychological pressure in those seconds was so great that the air seemed absolutely palpable. Meanwhile, the Roman light infantry unleashed a thick hail of sharp javelins on the slowing enemy. Thousands of projectiles soared into the air and fell in an arc on the disrupted formation of the Carthaginian front line. The lightly armed warriors threw their projectiles with maximum force, aiming at areas not protected by armor. This first volley further increased the chaos in the ranks of the advancing giant living targets. A large number of attacking units finally lost their formation and began to move chaotically across the plain. It was at this very moment that the Roman light infantry began their masterful reformation. Instead of standing still, they turned in unison and rushed into the prepared passages. Their movements were quick and precise, like a well-coordinated mechanism that did not allow a single mistake. The solid line of the Roman front suddenly parted, forming wide, gaping voids right in front of the attackers. The illusion of a solid barrier completely disappeared, giving way to the strict architecture of deep corridors. The advancing wave was faced with an unexpected choice at the moment of maximum acceleration. Ahead of them towered monolithic walls of Roman shields, and between them lay completely open paths. Instincts kicked in instantly. forcing the huge targets to choose a path that promised no frontal resistance. It is difficult to imagine the level of self-control of the Roman veterans standing close to these corridors. Giant silhouettes rushed past them at tremendous speed, raising clouds of acrid African dust. Carthage's living battering rams surged into the wide passages formed between the rows of legionnaires. Huge silhouettes rushed past the tightly closed Roman shields, encountering no frontal resistance on their way. The light infantry, safely hidden in the rear, continued to shower the passing targets with accurate javelin throws. The Roman veterans, forming the walls of the corridors, held their formation tightly, not succumbing to the general commotion. They methodically delivered flanking blows with heavy spears at the massive targets running past. Trapped in the narrow confines of the artificial corridors, the attackers found themselves in a completely hopeless situation. Their tremendous speed worked against them, drawing them deeper and deeper into the dense ranks of the Roman heavy infantry. The drivers lost the ability to maneuver as metal-studded walls rose on both sides. Caught in the crossfire of shells, many animals fell into a state of complete uncontrolled frenzy. They ran in a straight line, trying to leave this endless, dangerous labyrinth as quickly as possible. Some units of the Carthaginian vanguard rushed through the entire Roman formation from start to finish. They ran deep into the rear of the legions without inflicting significant damage on the infantry maniples. The Roman reserve troops, positioned behind the main forces, successfully intercepted and neutralized these remnants of the attack. The Carthaginian commander's main trump card dissolved into thin air, wasting its enormous energy completely. The strict geometric lines of the legions remained intact, retaining their high combat effectiveness. But not all of the attackers followed the safe routes offered to them through the Roman ranks. Frightened by the loud noise of the cornu and the hail of javelins, a significant part of the left flank of the Carthaginian attack turned around. Panicked, the giants rushed back, straight into the positions of their own Numidian cavalry. This unexpected turn of events caused tremendous confusion in the ranks of the Carthaginian cavalry allies. The dense cavalry formation was instantly broken by the large targets rushing about in disorder. A similar situation soon repeated itself on the right flank, where the attack also did not go according to the original plan. The animals, dodging flying spears, turned around and crashed into the positions of the Carthaginian heavy cavalry. The ensuing confusion allowed the Roman Numidian allies to launch their massive and aggressive attack. The Carthaginian superiority in cavalry was completely negated by their own main weapon. Both flanks of the Carthaginian army began to hastily leave the battlefield under pressure from the Roman horsemen. The dust above the battlefield thickened even more, obscuring the details of the cavalry clash on the flanks. In the center of the plain, however, the situation stabilized after the first devastating wave had passed. The Roman legions quickly closed ranks, restoring the classic solid line of heavy infantry. The architecture of the open corridors had fulfilled its grand task and was no longer needed in this battle. The legionaries regrouped into a monolithic wall of shields, preparing to clash with the main body of the enemy infantry. The failure of the first attack had a serious psychological impact on both sides. The Roman soldiers were convinced of the incredible effectiveness of their talented commander's tactics. The Carthaginian commander watched the collapse of his original plan with icy calm. He understood that the loss of his shock vanguard complicated the situation, but did not make it completely hopeless. He still had 3 dense lines of experienced and battle-hardened heavy infantry at his disposal. He gave the order to launch a general attack in order to engage the Romans in close combat as quickly as possible. A huge mass of people began to move slowly forward, raising new clouds of thick African dust. Now the outcome of the clash would be decided solely by a direct infantry confrontation between 2 huge armies. Complex tactical tricks gave way to brute force, discipline and the endurance of ordinary soldiers. The monolithic formations drew closer, ready to crash into each other with incredible kinetic energy. The air was filled with the dull rhythm of thousands of footsteps and the clang of heavy weapons against bronze shields. The most intense and exhausting phase of this legendary ancient battle was just beginning. While the heavy infantry was still closing in for the main attack, a drama of its own was unfolding at the edges of the plain. Roman and allied Numidian horsemen continued to pursue the disorganized Carthaginian cavalry. Clouds of thick dust receded further and further from the central area where the infantry formations were preparing to clash. The cavalry battle quickly moved beyond the sight of both outstanding commanders. The retreat of the Carthaginian cavalry seemed strange for such experienced and hardened warriors. Many military historians still argue whether this flight was a genuine result of panic from the attack of the giants. There is a version that the Carthaginian commander himself ordered his horsemen to lure the Roman cavalry away. Leaving the battlefield, they took with them the most mobile and dangerous part of the Roman military machine. This left the legion infantry alone with the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Carthaginian lines. The Roman commanders of the cavalry units were carried away by the pursuit of the retreating enemy over a great distance. They sought to completely destroy the enemy's flanks in order to ensure the safety of their own infantry. In the heat of the large-scale pursuit, they lost visual contact with the main forces of their heavy army. Their swift horses carried them further and further into the dry and hot North African desert. The central battlefield was completely cleared of any maneuverable cavalry units on both sides. Now, the two great commanders had to demonstrate their skill in commanding exclusively infantry lines. The situation on the plain became extremely simplified, turning into a classic clash of heavy foot formations. The absence of cavalry meant that quick flanking maneuvers and rapid maneuvers became virtually impossible. The outcome depended on the endurance of the soldiers and the ability of the commanders to bring fresh reserves into battle at the right moment. Both armies continued to advance at an even and measured pace, maintaining perfect geometric alignment. The Roman line advanced, putting forward a dense row of heavy and reliable full-length shields. The soldiers of the first row clutched their pilums tightly, preparing to hurl them at the enemy from a minimum distance. Behind them, veterans of the second and third lines marched steadily, providing reliable rear support. The Carthaginian mercenaries who made up the enemy's first line of defense responded with an equally menacing appearance. They quickened their pace, breaking into a light jog just before the inevitable collision of the lines. At throwing distance, the Roman legionaries stopped and fired a synchronized volley with their heavy spears. Thousands of metal tips pierced the wooden shields and armor of the advancing Carthaginian front line. The weight of the Roman pilums forced the mercenaries to throw down their pierced shields, leaving themselves completely unprotected. The powerful volley severely thinned the ranks of the attackers, breaking their initial aggressive pace of advance. Immediately after the throw, the Romans drew their short swords and crashed into the disorganized enemy formation with force. The clang of clashing metal and the dull thud of shields colliding drowned out all other sounds on the plain. Two huge masses of people locked in a fierce and incredibly dense hand-to-hand confrontation. The pressure from the rear ranks pushed the front soldiers forward, leaving them no room to maneuver. It was the relentless work of heavy infantry, requiring tremendous physical strength and endurance. The Roman legionaries, armed with short gladiuses, had the advantage in such an incredibly tight crush. The Carthaginian frontline mercenaries fought with incredible tenacity, trying to hold back the pressure of the legions. They used long, slashing swords, which lacked the space to swing in the dense formation. The Romans methodically worked their shields, pushing back the enemy and delivering short, thrusting blows from behind cover. Gradually, the front line began to buckle under the steady and continuous pressure of the disciplined Roman infantry. The Carthaginian vanguard began to slowly retreat, losing the initiative in this brutal clash. The retreating mercenaries tried to find refuge in the ranks of their own second infantry line. However, the Carthaginian militia standing behind them had strict orders not to break their formation. They thrust their spears forward, refusing to let the fleeing mercenaries into their protected rear. Caught between the advancing legions and the spears of their allies, the mercenaries were forced to retreat to the flanks. They spread out along the edges of the formation, leaving the Carthaginian second line alone to face the Romans. The clash with the Carthaginian militia required the Roman legionaries to exert maximum effort. The enemy's second line was fresh and determined to defend its positions to the end. The Roman infantry, exhausted from fighting the mercenaries, encountered fierce and very dense resistance. The front line stalled, and the legion's advance came to a complete standstill for a long time. The soldiers pushed each other with heavy shields, trying to break through the formation by sheer force. The Roman commander watched the situation closely, assessing the level of fatigue of his frontline troops. He realized that the first line of maniples needed an urgent respite before the decisive pressure. Obeying the loud commands of their officers, the Roman hastati began to retreat in an orderly fashion through special passages. Their places were immediately taken by fresh fighters from the second line, known in the Roman army as principes. This complex reorganization in the heat of battle demonstrated the high level of training of the Roman infantry. The renewed pressure of the legions forced the Carthaginian militia to begin a slow and difficult retreat. Step by step, they surrendered their positions, leaving the battlefield under the complete control of the Roman troops. The threat of a complete breakthrough of the central front forced the Carthaginian commander to bring in his main reserve. He gave the signal, and the third line of his army began its long-awaited advance. These were the legendary veterans of the Italian campaigns, undefeated for 15 long years. These hardened warriors were the most formidable and elite part of the entire vast Carthaginian army. Many of them were equipped with captured Roman armor obtained in previous great victories. Their formation was flawless, and their movements were incredibly synchronized and frighteningly calm. They formed a monolithic wall of shields and spears that stopped the retreating Carthaginian militia. The veterans forced the fleeing soldiers to the flanks, forming a single, incredibly long and dense defensive line. The Roman commander quickly assessed the scale of the new threat standing in the way of his advancing legions. He halted the advance of his troops, giving the soldiers a chance to catch their breath and restore their formation. The enemy had formed a front so long that it threatened to envelop the Roman ranks on both flanks. The classic Roman three-line formation became vulnerable to the threat of a large-scale encirclement. An immediate and unconventional decision was needed to counteract the numerical superiority of the long enemy formation. And then, Scipio gave an order that has gone down in history in all ancient military textbooks. He ordered all three lines of legions to turn around and form a single long, continuous line. The hastati took the central position, the principes lined up on the flanks, and the experienced triarii completed the flanks. The entire Roman army stretched across the plain, matching the length of the Carthaginian formation. This risky maneuver deprived the Romans of a deep reserve, but reliably protected them from being outflanked. Such a reformation required perfect coordination and absolute trust of the soldiers in their commander. Tens of thousands of men moved across the debris-strewn plain, taking up new, strictly assigned positions. Dust rose again in a column as the legions stretched out their ranks under the scorching African sun. The Carthaginian commander watched this maneuver, acknowledging the tactical genius of his young opponent. Two giant parallel lines of men stood facing each other in an ominous and tense silence. It was a moment of true balance of power when all previous tricks and deceptive maneuvers had been exhausted. Both armies deployed their best forces in one long and perfectly straight phalanx. The absence of cavalry deprived the commanders of the opportunity to launch a surprise attack from the rear or flank. Everything depended on whose infantry would prove more resilient in the grueling head-on pressure. The sun was at its zenith, mercilessly heating the tired soldiers encased in metal. At the command of the officers, both lines simultaneously moved toward each other like solid, monolithic walls. The dull rumble of thousands of footsteps echoed across the plain, merging into a single, frightening roar of attack. Huge shields were held forward, forming a continuous barrier of wood, leather, and metal. The distance narrowed until the front lines were within the reach of an outstretched heavy spear. The decisive and most intense phase of this grand historical confrontation was about to begin. In this final configuration, the clash became a test of pure will and physical endurance. No maneuver could now radically change the balance of power on the dusty battlefield. The long phalanxes locked together in monstrous tension, pressing down on each other with their entire enormous mass. The veterans of the Carthaginian line showed incredible tenacity, methodically repelling the attacks of the Roman infantry. Their formation was so dense that it seemed like a completely monolithic and impenetrable metal wall. They used their advantage in experience, wielding their swords sparingly and with maximum efficiency. The Romans responded with equally persistent pressure, trying to push through the enemy with discipline and training. The heaviest positional confrontation in the history of this conflict unfolded in the center of the front. The rear ranks pressed their shields against the backs of their comrades, creating continuous physical pressure forward. It was a battle of attrition, where every centimeter of space was won at the cost of incredible effort. Fatigue and dehydration became as dangerous enemies as the sharp blades of enemy swords. The scorching African sun mercilessly heated the heavy metal helmets and chainmail of the fighting warriors. Carthaginian veterans, who knew Roman tactics by heart, successfully blocked all attempts to break through the front line. They replaced the tired fighters in the front row in time, maintaining a constant high pace of close combat. Their actions were distinguished by frightening mechanical precision, honed over many years of continuous military campaigns. Roman officers had to personally stand in the front ranks to inspire their subordinates by personal example. The balance of forces was so equal that neither side could achieve the slightest tactical advantage. The flanks of both armies were also bogged down in heavy and fruitless positional infantry pressure. Stretched out in a single line, the legions lost their trademark flexibility and maneuverability of small units. They turned into a classic heavy phalanx that could only press forward in a straight line. The Carthaginian commander skillfully directed the defense, shifting small reserves to the most dangerous sections of the front. The Roman commander also remained behind his troops, controlling the integrity of the formed line. Time dragged on incredibly slowly in this exhausting and endless mechanical pushing of huge masses. Thick dust covered the soldiers' faces, preventing them from breathing normally and clogging the joints of their armor. The air was saturated with the smell of hot metal, sweat, and dry, churned-up African soil. The noise of battle turned into a continuous, monotonous hum, devoid of any distinct sounds or commands. Only iron discipline kept both huge armies from complete physical exhaustion and collapse. Neither commander could employ any new strategic maneuvers under the circumstances. The battlefield had become a giant scale, frozen in absolute but incredibly fragile equilibrium. The slightest breach in the defensive wall could lead to a chain reaction and the collapse of the entire front. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, giving orders to hold their positions at all costs. The soldiers became elements of a single mechanism, programmed only to push forward. During this period of the battle, The experience of the Carthaginian veterans began to give them a slight advantage. They were less frenzied, expending their physical energy only on the most necessary defensive movements. The Roman line began to experience enormous strain, especially in the central part of its stretched front. Gradually, the legionaries began to buckle under the steady and relentless pressure of their more experienced opponents. There was a real threat that the monolithic Roman formation would split into two separate parts. The Roman commander immediately rushed to the center to support the flagging spirits of his exhausted soldiers. His presence in the danger zone helped stabilize the sagging section of the huge infantry front. The legionaries gritted their teeth and dug their heels into the dry, dusty ground of the plain with renewed strength. Balance was restored, but it was clear that the Romans were at the limit of their physical capabilities. The Carthaginian commander coolly waited for the moment when his opponent's line would finally falter. In this stalemate, the outcome of the entire confrontation depended on an external factor capable of breaking the balance. Both commanders remembered well the cavalry that had left the battlefield at the very beginning of the clash. The return of the cavalry on either side could instantly decide the fate of this protracted and exhausting battle. The officers' eyes periodically darted into the distance, trying to make out moving silhouettes on the horizon through the thick dust. The fate of the Mediterranean was being decided not only here, but also somewhere in the invisible expanses of the desert. The tension reached its peak when a distant cloud of dust appeared from the rear of the Carthaginian army. The soldiers of both armies could not see it, as they were completely absorbed in close combat. However, the commanders, standing on small hills, immediately noticed the approach of a huge mass of horsemen. The point of no return in this great clash came completely unexpectedly for the fighting infantrymen. The cloud of dust on the horizon grew rapidly, approaching the rear positions of the Carthaginian veterans. Soon, silhouettes of horsemen rushing in a dense and wide formation became clearly visible through the haze. It was the combined Roman and Numidian cavalry returning after successfully crushing the enemy flanks. They appeared at the very moment when the infantry lines had reached the point of maximum exhaustion. The Carthaginian commander instantly realized the tragic nature of the tactical situation his army was in. His experienced veterans were tied up in heavy fighting on the front and couldn't regroup. Stretched out in a single long line, the phalanx was completely defenseless against a massive attack from the rear. He had no reserves to form a new line of defense against the advancing cavalry. The outcome of the battle, which had seemed uncertain just a minute ago, was now absolutely crystal clear. The Roman horsemen, without slowing down, crashed into the backs of the Carthaginians with a deafening whistle and shouts. The powerful kinetic impact of the multi-ton horse-mounted mass fell upon the unprotected rear of the veterans. The Carthaginian line of defense instantly buckled, unable to withstand such colossal pressure from both sides. The Roman infantry immediately increased their pressure from the front, sensing the long-awaited support of their cavalry. The Carthaginian veterans found themselves caught in a vice between the heavy shields of the legions and the hooves of war horses. The monolithic formation of the invincible Carthaginian soldiers began to rapidly disintegrate into separate pockets of resistance. The discipline that had held them together for all these hours collapsed under the weight of the inevitable large-scale encirclement. The veterans tried to turn around to repel the attacks of the horsemen, exposing their backs to the Roman infantry. The huge military machine, which had previously operated with impeccable precision, was completely disorganized. The pride of the Carthaginian army turned into a disorganized mass of people fleeing from the cavalry. The Roman light cavalry masterfully cut through the disintegrating enemy formation, preventing it from regrouping. The Numidian horsemen delivered precise blows with their spears, destroying the last attempts to organize a focal defense. The Roman legionaries advanced step by step, closing in on the retreating troops. panic spread across the battlefield with incredible speed, robbing the soldiers of their will to resist. The greatest army of antiquity ceased to exist as an organized and controlled fighting unit. At this critical moment, the Carthaginian commander realized that further resistance was completely pointless. He gathered a small detachment of trusted horsemen around him and headed for the open desert. His retreat was the only chance to preserve freedom to continue the political struggle in the capital itself. He left the battlefield, leaving his defeated legions at the mercy of the triumphant Roman soldiers. An entire era of Carthaginian genius invincibility ended under the hooves of Numidian and Roman cavalry. The enemy troops remaining on the plain began to throw down their heavy weapons en masse and surrender their positions. The encirclement closed in completely, depriving them of any hope of an organized and safe retreat. The Roman commanders gave the order to cease pursuit and begin the organized collection of the surrendered soldiers. The grand battle, which had kept the entire ancient world in suspense, came to its logical and rapid conclusion. Silence gradually began to return to the dusty plain, replacing the continuous roar of many hours of fighting. Roman soldiers sank to the ground right where they stood, breathing heavily from colossal fatigue. They threw off their heavy helmets, exposing their faces to the light evening breeze coming from the sea. Their armor was covered with a thick layer of dust, and their muscles were cramping from hours of tension. They had just won the most significant victory of their lives, forever changing the course of world history. Their commander-in-chief proudly surveyed the battlefield, realizing the magnitude of today's triumph. The dust gradually settled, revealing the full picture of the massive historical clash that had just ended. The complex architecture of open corridors, the rearrangement of lines, and the maneuvers of the cavalry merged into a single masterpiece of tactics. The Roman war machine proved its absolute effectiveness and ability to adapt with incredible flexibility. The brute force of massive animals suffered a crushing defeat in the face of iron discipline and reason. This day became the starting point for the formation of a new global Mediterranean political reality. The news of the defeat of the invincible Carthaginian commander spread throughout the ancient world like thunder. The news carried not only information about the outcome of the battle, but also a declaration of a new era of domination. Rome had transformed from a regional power into an absolute hegemon with no equal rivals on the continent. The immediate results of the clash on the plain had enormous strategic consequences for Carthage. The capital was completely defenseless in the face of the advancing and victorious Roman legions. The city council was forced to sue for peace on terms that were extremely harsh for Carthage. The city lost all its overseas territories, its naval fleets, and its right to conduct independent foreign policy. Once the greatest trading empire of antiquity, it was reduced to the status of an insignificant regional state. The Roman commander returned to his hometown with a triumph unprecedented in its scale and luxury. For his outstanding achievements on the African continent, he was awarded the honorary nickname Africanus. His name became a symbol of military genius, innovation, and the ability to defeat the strongest enemies. He proved that the Roman legions could be not only a heavy phalanx, but also an incredibly flexible instrument. His tactical developments formed the basis for all further development of Roman military affairs. The use of giant animals on the battlefield ultimately proved to be completely strategically untenable. The ingenuity of Roman officers clearly demonstrated how easy it was to neutralize this living, striking force. The construction of empty corridors became a classic example of how to turn the enemy's strength against itself. No other commander in history placed such high hopes on this unstable type of troops. The weapon of terror was forever consigned to the scrap heap of obsolete and ineffective tactical solutions. Despite his crushing defeat, The defeated Carthaginian leader retained his reputation as a brilliant strategist. His campaigns in Europe continued to be studied in military academies for many generations to come. However, the defeat at Zama proved that even the greatest mind can be surpassed by discipline and training. His opponent was better prepared for the specific conditions of the decisive general battle. It was not so much a defeat of talent as of the very system of organization of the military machine. The Roman army emerged from this conflict incredibly strong, professional, and confident in its power. The legionaries gained invaluable experience in maneuvering large formations right in the middle of battle. The complex system of maniples, capable of rearranging themselves from a checkerboard formation into solid lines, proved its effectiveness. This organizational principle allowed Rome to conquer vast territories throughout the world in the future. Intelligence and coordinated teamwork prevailed over individual heroism and brute physical force. The historical significance of this particular day cannot be overestimated in terms of the development of Western civilization as a whole. The balance of power in the Mediterranean basin shifted irrevocably and definitively in favor of the Roman Republic. All political, economic, and cultural processes were now directed from a single center of power. If the outcome of the clash had been different, we would now be studying a completely different world history. The Carthaginian model of development gave way forever to the rapidly gaining momentum of Roman expansion. The lessons of this incredible victory were carefully documented by Roman chroniclers for future generations. The tactic of open passages became a textbook example of the commander's unconventional and creative military thinking. The ability of a commander to abandon formulaic solutions in order to adapt to the threat was extolled as the highest virtue. Veterans of the African campaign enjoyed enormous respect in society until the end of their lives. They became living witnesses to the birth of the most powerful empire of the ancient world. The dusty plains of North Africa preserve the memory of thousands of soldiers who clashed in this grand battle. Today, this place looks quiet and serene, hiding traces of the colossal tension of human forces under the sand. But studying the details of the maneuvers of both armies still inspires admiration among modern researchers and strategists. The elegance of the Roman infantry's geometric formations amazes the imagination with its impeccable and rigorous logic. It was a true triumph of order over chaos, reason over instinct, and discipline over brute force. The end of this protracted conflict marked the beginning of a completely new era in the development of all humanity. Roman civilization, tempered by the most severe trials, was ready to extend its influence to new lands. Their roads, laws, and architecture would soon span vast distances from misty Britain to hot Egypt. And all this incredible grandeur was built on a solid foundation laid on that scorching African day. The day when a living, indestructible avalanche crashed into the invisible void of the Roman infantry corridors. A deep analysis of such historical events allows us to better understand the nature of human ingenuity and will. The strategies used 2,000 years ago are still reflected in modern management concepts. The ability to turn an opponent's main advantage into their main weakness remains a universal rule of any struggle. The story of the Battle of Zama is not just a tale of two ancient armies clashing on the edge of the desert. It is an eternal monument to the power of the human mind, capable of finding a way out of the most insoluble situation. Do you think the Carthaginian army would have had even the slightest chance of victory if the corridor tactic had not worked? Share your detailed and reasoned opinion in the comments below this video. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting historical investigations into the great battles of the past.